Okay, I see the live on YouTube signal. So good morning. It's Friday, January 14th, 10:37 a.m. This is the meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy, and we are going to reintroduce a bill introduced last session, but left on the back burner in between, and that bill is S-129, an act relating to the management of fish and wildlife. We'll start with a bill walkthrough by Mr. O'Grady, and then Senator Campion will go to you and talk a little bit about what made you want to bring the bill to the committee. So with that, Mr. O'Grady, the floor is yours.
Sure. Do you want me to share screen, or does everyone have a copy? Okay.
Yes, please.
All right.
Okay, looks just starting to say looks good. Now we're just seeing a Microsoft symbol.
Okay.
Here we go.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay. So before I talk about, well, first, this is Mike O'Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. Before I talk about the substance of the bill, I just want to talk a little bit about how the current statutory structure is set up for the management and regulation of wildlife in the state. So by statute and arguably by constitution, the wildlife of the state are held in trust for the public, and the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife is designated by statute as the entity that manages those animals, the wildlife, for the benefit of the public. In addition, by statute, the Fish and Wildlife Board is granted the authority to adopt by rule requirements for the means and manner of taking wildlife. The Commissioner of Wildlife by statute serves as the executive secretary of the board, and the board provides, and the department provides the board with staffing and expertise and recommendations, but the board ultimately is the entity that adopts rules for the means and manner of taking of wildlife in the state. What S-129 would do would be to transfer the authority to adopt rules regarding the taking of wildlife from the board to the commissioner. The board would not be eliminated, but it would instead become an advisory board that would advise the commissioner on rules to be adopted for the management of wildlife, and there would be standards that the advisory board would review any proposed rule for. In addition, the composition of the Fish and Wildlife Board would be changed to not solely reflect the membership from one person from each county of the state, but to reflect geographic diversity, but to also reflect expertise and interest in the management of wildlife. So that's generally what the bill does. Before I go on, I'll pause to see if anyone has any questions before I go into the detail.
Sure, I do have a logistical question, and that is, when individuals are appointed to the Fish and Wildlife Board, do they come before the legislature or the Senate for approval, or we're notified that individuals are appointed?
They do not require Senate approval.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving forward, you see Section 1 amends two sections of law, 40 and 41. These are the authority of the department. You'll see that it's being clarified that the department shall be under the direction and supervision of the commissioner. And in addition to duties provided, the commissioner shall have the duties under 3 VSA 2852. Those are basically the mandatory duties of commissioners and the discretionary duties of commissioners on page 2, line 2 under 3 VSA 2853. And then the commissioner shall implement a policy and purposes specified in section 4081 of this title where appropriate and to the extent resources of the department allow. We're going to get to that in a minute, to what is in 4081 and what is that policy. Then you'll see the establishment of the Fish and Wildlife Board. First change is changing the composition in the numbers from 14 to 12. And it's no longer from each county appointed by the governor. Actually, it does say right now that they are with the advice and consent of the Senate, but I honestly don't recall them ever being put in front of you. So instead of it being appointed by the governor, there will be 4 members appointed by the commissioner, 4 members of the board appointed by the speaker, and 4 members appointed by the committee on committees. And then in order to be appointed to the board, a person has to apply to the relevant appointing authority. And when considering the applicants, the appointing authority has to give due consideration to the need for geographic diversity, as I referenced earlier, and then the need for the board members to have a history of involvement with the dedication to fish, wildlife conservation, and natural resources. And then when they are appointed, the board member receives training from the department on coexistence with wildlife, the reduction of conflict between humans and wildlife, and the impacts of climate change on fish and wildlife.
Can I ask you a quick practical question on those criteria that you just went through in terms of who might be appointed?
Mm-hmm.
In addressing the need, if 3 different parties are doing the appointment, who reconciles who's fulfilling which of the criteria? You know what I mean?
That's a dynamic and a tension that often plays out when you have multiple appointing authorities. Those authorities need to consult with each other and confer. There's often competition as to who gets to appoint whom. And that can create difficulty. It can create delay in appointment. And I have numerous examples of that. So that's a good point to be aware of. But at the same time, multiple appointing authorities is pretty common. You know, it can create a tension, but it's pretty common. So here's the role, or one of the roles that the board will now play. Upon filing a proposed rule with the Secretary of State, the department shall submit the proposed rule to the board for review. The board holds a public hearing and considers whether the proposed rule is designed to maintain the best health, population, and utilization levels of the regulated species, of other necessary or desirable species that are ecologically related to the regulated species, and whether the rules are adequately supported by investigation and research conducted by the department. So the board is no longer enacting the rules or adopting the rules. The board is reviewing the rules for this standard. Now, if the board by majority vote determines that a proposed rule should be revised, it submits the recommended revisions to the department and the reasons why, and any public comment that they received regarding that. The department is directed to consider the recommendations of the board, but it is not required to adopt the recommendations of the board because the board is advisory. But if there is going to be if the department determines that it's not going to adopt it, they have to give a response why. And the board's written report and the department's response shall be included with the material submitted to LCAR. So what this kind of sets up, that if there is disagreement between the department and the board, that LCAR is going to be the one that kind of serves as the site for resolution. So then you move on.
And I have a quick question on that one. Is there any other structure that you're aware of in statute that creates that sort of dynamic where competing views might be presented and resolved at LCAR?
There are a few different mechanisms that are similar to this, but not exactly the same. The Endangered Species Committee basically has to review and approve rules regarding threatened and endangered species. What used to be the Pesticide Advisory Council and then now is the Agriculture Innovation Board, they effectively have to approve any regulation of treated article pesticides. And so the children and the Chemicals of High Concern to Children Working Group, they have a role in review of commissioners' rules. And actually they used to have to approve, but now they just review. And if the commissioner doesn't like the rule and goes forward without the recommendation, that's probably the closest one currently, that the working group for the Chemicals of High Concern to Children no longer has to approve a rule, but offers their input. And if the commissioner doesn't follow it, then their input is submitted to, that's probably the closest model right now.
Okay, thank you.
You'll see that on page 4, line 7 through 10, that the commissioner's appointment is being struck. It's not that he's or she is no longer appointed. They're already appointed under 3 VSA 2851. This is just duplicative. And then because the board is advisory and not a rulemaking entity anymore, the commissioner really doesn't have to be a member. And so he's no longer the executive secretary of the board. Then you'll get to the policy statement that I referred to earlier, 4081. You'll see there's no changes in 4081A, that the Fish and Wildlife are held in trust by the state for the benefit of its citizens. You'll see the commissioner is the one that is designated to manage and regulate them in accordance with the requirements of this part, but no longer with the rules of the Fish and Wildlife Board, because they're now going to be the department rules. And then you'll see that the Fish and Wildlife Board, being the agency charged with carrying out the purposes of this subchapter, is struck, and it's now going to be the commissioner or the department. And you'll see conforming changes in 4081 regarding that. And then you come to the section of law 4082 that gives the board currently the authority to adopt rules for the regulation of fish and wildlife and the taking thereof. That is being transferred to the department. So one of the things you'll see is the rules currently are required to be supported by investigation and research conducted by the department on behalf of the board. Now it's going to just be conducted by the department. You'll see conforming changes in this section in the transfer of the rulemaking authority from the board to the department. Then you'll see conforming changes. The next few sections are changing board to department. This is a conforming change in there's a provision in Title III that unless otherwise provided, all boards that are created are advisory boards. except there's an exception for the Fish and Wildlife Board in current law on page 10, line 9 and 10, that says it has the powers that are given to it by law and a regulatory or quasi judicial function. Since the Fish and Wildlife Board is now going to be advisory, it's no longer going to have this exception. And so that is struck. And then there's a conforming revision. So whenever in statute there's a reference to the board, and it should be the department, you'd be giving the Office of Legislative Counsel the ability to make those changes. There's specific directive on some of the sections where board is included, and it should now be department. But then there's also the general authority when the revisions are substantially similar to those described. So then you come to page 11, section 7. So an interesting thing about the Fish and Wildlife regulations is they were enacted in statute. So, and they are the only rules I know that were enacted by statute. And so, and there are still Fish and Wildlife Board rules that are in the same form that they were when they were enacted in statute in 1961. And when they were enacted in 1961, the legislature said, the General Assembly said, that the board can amend them, but that the General Assembly can amend them also. So one of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit is how to transfer the authority from the board to the department for these rules and still have the ability of the General Assembly to amend the rules by statute. I think this does it, but I want to reserve the right to think about this a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'm just putting this on the table. I want to reserve the General Assembly's authority to amend the Fish and Wildlife rules. But I think this does it, but I'm not 100% confident.
Okay.
So you'll see that the Fish and Wildlife regulations promulgated by the board and in effect as of the effective date of this act remain in effect and have the full force and effect of law until such time as they are repealed or amended by the Department of Fish and Wildlife pursuant to 3 VSA Chapter 25. So they remain in effect, but I think what I want to do is add a section that says, or a sentence that says, and the General Assembly retains the authority under Acts and Resolves 1961, I think it's 113, to amend the rules by statute, something like that. So that's what I'm struggling a little bit with. I went back and forth on it when I was drafting the bill, but I was looking at the 1961 law the other day, and I'm like, I think I probably want to decide to add a reference to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the bill. It goes into effect on passage.
Okay. Great. Any questions about the language from Mr. O'Grady, or questions more generally about the law?
I would just, I remember back to the Senate approval. I think these are folks that we've all called over the years and just checked in with. I don't remember having anybody into committee per se, but these are individual phone calls we've all made and put on lists and then been approved by the Senate. Again, as I talked a little bit about last year, I feel this is an important shift at this point. Let's put some, these powers, this ability in the hands of the department, which has more resources. It also is a way for people to really run on an issue, if you will. So if some of the changes that people out there are advocating for it, they should be able to ask their, gubernatorial candidate, what are their values around this, and not say, hey, I guess they could ask that now, but it's left up to this advisory council. I'd rather have it left up to an advisory council than people actually have the decision making. It's not too dissimilar from some of the shifts that we've made at the State Board of Education. Get these issues more out into the public and see if candidates can talk a little bit more about them, during their elections, and see if these are issues that are important to constituents and Vermonters. They may look for candidates and support people that represent, kinds of shifts they're looking to make. So I know we're due on the floor, but that's my sort of quick.
Right. Well, we have half an hour, and actually we have the new.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have it down for 11. I apologize.
We have the new commissioner who's just actually joined us in Zoom that will be formally making an introduction in just a moment. So, Senator Westman.
So, just in the details of this, and I apologize, so right now, stuff that goes through the Fish and Wildlife Board, does it all go to LCAR?
Yes. I mean, the Fish and Wildlife Board does a lot of fact finding, and they'll have presentations, etc. So that type of background work doesn't go to LCAR, but if they're going to adopt anything of general applicability for hunting and fishing, then yes, it goes to LCAR.
So let me ask, because historically they were in a somewhat different position. So if they change the rules around deer hunting, and they say there's going to be antler season here, that doesn't go before LCAR, that remains in the Fish and Wildlife Board.
Right. And so just to Senator Westman's point, the General Assembly used to be the entity that set certain requirements, such as the length of the deer season, whether or not there was going to be antlerless, etc. But in 2004, it was 2004, you delegated that authority to the board. And when you delegated it in 2004, certain provisions, such as whether or not there was going to be an antlerless season, whether or not what the catch provisions are for migratory birds, what the moose season was going to be, etc., and how many moose, that was supposed to be set by rule as well. And for a while, it was set by rule. But what was happening, especially with regard to the migratory bird rule, which is dependent on federal catch limits, is that the federal provisions were coming in too late for the state to comply with the APA. And there was a question of whether or not it was sufficiently meeting the standard for an emergency rule. So what the General Assembly did was allow the board and the department to set those catch limits by a procedure and not by rule. And that tool of setting by procedure has been used for antlerless and for moose as well. I can get you the specifics on what it's allowed for, but so there are certain things that used to be set by the General Assembly, and then you delegated them to the board to be set by rule, but then you allow the department and the board to set them by a procedure.
I would just say, from my point of view, I want to make sure that remains the same, and the legislature doesn't get into antlerless deer or any of those. And and the other areas you mentioned with migratory birds, that should be something that should stay in the department. or the board, or however we end up on this. But I don't think the legislature should be doing that.
Yeah, it would seem like an act of mercy not to have the legislature discussing anything around
Well,
deer season.
The debates used to take days. Like
Yes,
days.
I was here.
Right. Senator McDonald.
Could you explain, one of the other areas of concern is that the legislature often is not in session when the federal government makes changes, and someone has to deal with that in the absence of the legislature being here, and what the role of LCAR is in doing some sort of review of such changes.
That's a good point. And to both that point, Senator McDonald and Senator Westman's point, the authority to set the migratory bird catch limits, the antlerless deer and the moose provisions, they're all statutory. They're all statutory provisions so that they would control over any provision and rule. So that authority would remain in effect, and is not directly affected by this bill right now.
Can you help me understand better? Each year, the commissioner usually brings forward a miscellaneous fish and wildlife bill that includes provisions around game and penalties, et cetera. So what are we seeing brought forward in that way, and why, compared to having it originate with the Fish and Wildlife Board?
So what you often see in the miscellaneous bill from the Department of Fish and Wildlife are clarifications on enforcement of a violation, or enhanced penalties for violations. When you look at the 10 VSA 4201, that's one of the enforcement sections for the department, because the board is not the enforcer. The board is not the one that enforces. The board adopts and amends the regulation, and the department and the state's attorneys enforce. And 4201 is the uniform point system. And so almost every violation is referenced in one way or another. Every violation of statute or rule is referenced in 4201 in one way or another. So that is often what the department is bringing forward, is they've amended the rules. There needs to be a revision to 4201, or they want an enhanced penalty for a certain type of violation, such as a big game violation. And then there are things that are probably more statutory in nature, like discharging a weapon across a road, using a crossbow if you're it used to be if you had a medical condition that required it, but now no. And that's something that the General Assembly, as the ultimate policy maker under the Constitution, probably that was the most appropriate way to do it, through legislative action and not through rulemaking.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the interplay. The statute always trumps rule. The legislature is the ultimate policy maker through their enactment of a statute, but you have delegated some of that policy making currently to the Fish and Wildlife Board. And the department every year brings, or not always every year, but usually brings forward a miscellaneous bill to address those policy considerations in both statute and rule.
Great. Thanks for clearing that up. Senator McCormick.
Going back a little bit, now could you explain the difference between a rule and a procedure? Because I dread making that distinction before the Rotary.
Sure. It's a good question. You're not going to get a good answer.
I suspected that might be the case.
There is a definition in 3 VSA, Chapter 35, the Administrative Procedure Act, or Chapter 25. And I will try to find the definition of procedure for you.
Well, we don't have to choose committee time now, maybe, but I mean, bottom line, it's the government telling you what you can and can't do, right?
Well, yes, a procedure. So first you have to start out with what is a practice. There's practice, procedures, and rules. So a practice is a substantive or procedural requirement of an agency. So it's something that an agency does, affecting one or more persons who are not employees of the agency, that is used by the agency in the discharge and powers of its duties. So that's a practice. Now, a procedure is a practice that has been adopted in writing, either at the election of the agency or as a result of a petition for the agency to put that practice in writing. The term includes any practice of an agency that's been adopted except for rules. So, and so what is a rule? A rule means each agency statement of general applicability that implements, interprets, or prescribes law or policy, and that has been adopted in a manner provided by the Administrative Procedure Act. So how do you kind of distill this down to? So agencies have the practices that govern their own procedure, right? That how they operate and what they do. And sometimes those practices have an impact on persons other than the agency. And that's a practice. And an agency can formalize that practice by writing it down in a procedure. But it's not supposed to be of general applicability to the state. Whereas a rule is law and has general applicability for the entire state. What you have done with some of the procedures is said that in these limited instances where this procedure is only going to have an impact on the certain number of migratory bird hunters, or the certain number of people hunting antlerless deer or hunting moose, you said it's appropriate for the department to set those standards by procedure. It's something that they are going to enforce internally, how many people they allow or what the catch limit is, but it obviously has an effect on that smaller class of people. It's not of general applicability to the entire hunting and fishing community. It's only for those people that have the waterfowl stamp, have the antlerless stamp, and have the moose stamp, so or license. So that's kind of how that's kind of how I've advised the committees on what they're doing with that procedure tool. But it is, as Senator Westman noted, it's a very effective and efficient tool to deal with some of these issues that are posed to the hunting and fishing community.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Well, people are taking notes. There'll be a quiz on the distinction between.
Yes, it's like
We
next
wonder why.
Friday.
And we
Senator
wonder why the
McDonald
folks-
probably might be the better one to answer that question since he's been dealing with it for decades.
All right,
And we
so-
wonder why the folks out there hate us.
So Senator McDonald, last comment question to you, and then let's pivot to meeting the new commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've asked previous commissioners what the thorniest things that they've had to deal with. And the one that I've had commissioners tell me how the tension between bear hunters and the traditional bear hunting of dogs, and how that tension between running dogs and property owners who are more likely to post property today and be distressed by dogs passing through, yelping and doing what bear dogs do. And the owners of those dogs, showing up later in vehicles as the owners follow and participate in bear hunting. How will the changes that are being proposed here, Mr. O'Grady, alter how that situation gets resolved, or if any changes are to come in the future to resolve the tension between bear hunters and property owners? Are the changes that are proposed in this statute likely to alter that balance of power, or resolve the situation, or make it the resolution of that thing less likely to happen?
Well, some of the tensions are created not by rule, but by statute. The length of season, the length of training authorized, the lack of limitations. So the General Assembly would need to address those tensions, and this bill would not allow the department to change those standards that are currently in place in statute. There are provisions in the rules that are part of the tension, that most notably the definition of control of the dog and the hound. And if the department wanted to propose a change to that, they could. It would now be subject to the advisory board's review and the new standard for review in their advisory capacity. And so I don't think it's going to resolve the tension necessarily. I think that tension will likely be there as long as some people want to hunt with hounds and some people don't want them to hunt with hounds.
So anyone who would oppose the bill that we're looking at, it would be not likely that someone who opposes this bill would claim to be on one side or the other of the bear hound issue, and that this bill somehow was going to give advantage to one side or the other, that it is neutral in its nature, and that whatever gets resolved on the bear issue will be basically resolved. That this bill isn't going to favor one side or the other.
I can make arguments that the bill favors one side or the other. I could say that I can make an argument that because it's no longer a board made up of governor appointees that now is made up of certain persons that have to show a dedication to certain aspects of wildlife, and that they have to then take a training, that it's probably less of a hunter-based board than it has been in the past. But at the same time, I would argue that the department is still the entity that would adopt this rule. And under current scheme, the department is supposed to want to advise the rule on the science and the recommended changes. So consequently, there might not be much change at all if now that the department is the one that's adopting the rule. So I can argue back and forth that it's either beneficial to one side or the other, or it's not really consequential in the tensions on some of these issues.
And where will the buck stop if there were to be a change in the current policy, practice, procedure, or rule? Where would the buck stop?
With the General Assembly.
Okay. Which is where the buck stops today. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you very much.
You always have the policy authority to supersede rule and to set your own policy requirement.
So we are stuck with it whether we make this change or not. And Okay. As
Uh,
we should be. Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Senator McDonald, for helping get that clarification. Senator Westman, let's do something brief and then we'll kennel
So
up the questions
this
and
is
move
going to be
on.
very brief, and Michael can probably not answer this, but how many times has the board overruled what the department has brought to them?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Well,
There have been instances when they're not totally aligned.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how often that is.
Okay. So the bill is resurrecting a very lively conversation related to some concerns we've had in this committee for years. And good morning, Commissioner Herrick. I actually didn't think you were going to be sort of stepping into a live discussion on a bill that we're just going to be reintroducing it, but we might as well. The session's underway, so baptism by fire. Good morning and welcome to you. Good to see you in here. I've seen you in all previous incarnations in the Government Operations Committee.
That's correct. And thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I thought I'd just give a brief history, and I understand that we're running against the clock here, so I'll truncate my intro because I'm sure I'm going to be sitting with you many times over the next couple months. I noticed in the agenda for today's, I'm listed as the Commissioner of Public Safety. I think Commissioner Sherling would gladly give me that position, but I am the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. But many people did know me most recently as the Deputy Commissioner of Public Safety. Prior to that, I was the Emergency Management Director. And prior to that, for 17 years, I was Chief of the State Hazmat Response Team. And I think I've sat in committee with every senator that I see on my screen today. And then in October, the governor's office asked if I was interested in being the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. And in my 23 years with state government, I've made thousands and thousands of decisions, and that was the easiest one for me to make. And I responded in the affirmative. I am an outdoorsy person. I do all things outdoors. I like to hike with my dog. She heard me, so now she thinks we're going. I like to fish. I do like to hunt. I have a house up in Canaan where I spend a lot of time, or as much time as I can. I live up in Grand Isle, and I manage my 10 acres here as well. So the outdoors in Vermont is very near and dear to my heart. I've been learning quickly. I enter this discussion while it's engaged. There is no downtime, but I've learned some things in the last 3 months on the job. And I look at what Fish and Wildlife does, and it seems to me that sometimes all people think about are things that are in the paper and headlines, but there's a lot of great things that we do. And I'll mention a few because I think it's important that there's a broader perspective of the department. We have the Let's Go Fishing program, which introduces fishing to folks of all ages and addresses bringing folks in underserved communities into the fold. We have a hunter ed course that's fantastic, and it's completely online now, which makes it more accessible for folks. And of course, we have the conservation camps. Here's a great story. The wardens, you may have heard, took it upon themselves, and rather than having some of our deer that get hit by cars go to waste, they have personally managed the deer and provided 12,596 meals to the food shelf for needy Vermonters. And that's really healthy food. So that's a great thing that the wardens do, among all the other great things they do. How about conservation of habitat? In the past year, we added 446 acres in the Roaring Brook, which will help protect 2 federally listed endangered species, the long-eared bat and the northern bulrush, and an additional 674 acres in the Champlain Basin, bringing our total up to about 135,000 statewide. We've seen great success in the management of our loon population. That is much more healthy than it has been. Our bald eagle, our nesting pairs are up. Bear population is up. In 1975, we had a low of 1,200 bear in the state, and now we're up around 5,000. And then there's another project that I want you to be aware of, and it's called Stay Connected, because one of the biggest thing that endangers our species, our animals, and our plants in the state is the fragmentation of their habitat. And some of that fragmentation can be exacerbated by roadways. And so we're working with the Agency of Transportation. Our biologists are working with their engineers to look at highway projects where we can build underpasses that facilitate the passage of all types of animals. We also look at areas where it's critical, and there's one in Stowe on Route 100, and it's the only place where we have connectivity of the Green Mountains to the Worcester Range and everything east all the way up to Maine and Nova Scotia. This has become critically important as we consider the impacts of climate change on these various species, whether they're plant or animal based. And this is incredibly good work that everybody should be aware of and be proud of. And I mention this because it is in a little bit of alignment with the discussion you were just having. All these great things that I've just mentioned, especially the last one, we rely on the expertise of our scientists. These are people who are dedicated to the conservation of our habitat, of our fish, our animals, and our plants in the state of Vermont, which we know we hold in trust for the people of the state. And these successes are based on their recommendations of the best science available and their knowledge and expertise. And I want us to, as we move forward in our discussions on the various issues that we're gonna be talking about, let's remember that is what drives the decision-making at the department, is what our scientists believe is best, and they've shown their success. And so I say that because I find that as the commissioner, I'm actually blessed with incredibly dedicated, incredibly smart people who have a difficult job in that they have to make me look good. And that's a tough job, trust me, but I am happy to be there. I'm proud of everything that we do over there. And I'm really, every time I meet with people who work there, everybody is happy to work there. They're excited about the work we're doing, no matter what it is, because they believe that we're doing good every day. And so I look forward to working with all of you closely over the next few months. And if I can answer any general questions now, but I know you have to run to the floor.
Well, thank you for understanding the rhythms and schedules of the legislature so well. Any committee questions or comments for the commissioner? All right. Well, thank you for coming in. It's good to see you again.
You too. And I will tell you, the two best things about my job now is this is the second day I've worn a tie since I started. And I haven't shaved since I became the commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, which is a big change from public safety. But it's a little bit of a different culture. But thanks, everybody. Have a good week. I know there's a storm coming in this weekend, so please be safe. And let me give you my email address. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly, and I hope you will. It's Christopher .Herrick, Herrick, @ Vermont.gov.
Okay.
And I look
great.
forward to working with you folks, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Sen McCormick, are you saying goodbye, or are we all?
Saying goodbye.
All right, great. Well, we have 3 minutes to stretch and relax and walk to the floor. So